I want to talk briefly about Brexit and some of the events of last week, but I don't want to do so in terms of looking at various charts and discussing what traders should and should not have done in an attempt to either be profitable or to not be hammered, which seems to be what happened to a vast number of traders last week. The decision of Great Britain to leave the EU did take people by surprise, but I have a view, and my view is that all things around us, both macro and micro, tend to cycle through a series of natural events. We move through certain cycles. We see this in our own life. In our own life, we start off as children with no control over ourselves, no control over our environment. And gradually our control over ourselves and our environment expands and expands and expands. It reaches an apex, a high point, some point during our life. And then as we get older, it begins to contract, and we contract back to a state which was similar to how we were as children. Now, my view has been probably formulated and solidified by my academic and early professional training. In science, you see cycling of events all the time. You see this natural rhythm. And my view of Brexit and my wider view of what's happened in the UK is in many ways probably coloured by this philosophical approach that I have. Britain started life as a series of very disparate little hamlets that were largely dependent upon subsistence farming. During this time, these isolated hamlets were at the mercy of raiders from all over the place. And this is a Viking longboat. This is the most intact specimen ever recovered, and it sits in a Viking maritime museum in Oslo in Norway. But the intriguing thing about Britain and its history is A, that it is so rich in colour and tone, but also that they manage to not only survive from these periods, but absorb different cultures and to take people on board and to learn from them. And the interesting thing about England, and it's something we forget, is that their very, very rich history and their very, very rich intellectual history gave us the likes of Chaucer, it gave us the likes of Shakespeare, it gave us our system of government, which, whilst not perfect, is, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, better than all the other alternatives. It gave us our system of law, and this is something upon which our society is built. But further to that, they actually built the modern world. The Industrial Revolution was an English event. It ushered in the scientific, technological, and engineering world we have now. Without that impetus, without that occurring, we would still be doing everything by hand, with no machine aid whatsoever. And this Industrial Revolution they had enabled them to power and defend an empire that spanned the globe. But all things cycle, all things change, and it should be remembered at not the high watermark of the empire, but as the sun was setting on the empire, that it was the English that led very much for some time a lone defence against fascism. And you could state that the emotional high point of this occurred during the summer of 1940, when a few hundred young men threw themselves into the sky day after day after day. But the issue with all these things is that these are memories of a past that has gone. It disappeared into the mists of time a very, very, very long time ago. So these are nostalgic things. These are things that people look back to. And I think what has happened in part with the psychology of the Brexit vote, particularly when you look at the demographic of how age groups voted, you see this yearning for a time that, if it ever existed, has actually passed. Now think about this in the context of your own life, and particularly your own trading. We view our history as a narrative we've constructed. We view it through a prism of our personality. So we colour and change events. But to put this in the perspective of traders, think about trades you got wrong, and I don't mean trades that you took where the ultimate end was that the trade was a loss and you followed your plan. Think about it in terms of trades whereby you took a trade where there was no signal. Looking back, what is your rationalisation for that trade? I'm quite certain that, like everybody else, you construct a narrative to review what has occurred, and you change the actual history to fit your view of history, what you want it to be. The same is true when we look at trades that we let get away. We construct rationale as to why that might be. Again, we mould our narrative to suit the need to defend our ego. And if we look at the way the English voted, you can see it's the old people who wanted out, not the young. The young people have a more optimistic and a more worldly view, a more global view. A cynic might say a less racist view. But they understood that the world has changed. Old people yearned for something that was never there. Here in Australia we do the same thing. If you look at the conservative side of politics, they yearn for a time that was not there. They yearn for a time when it was 1966, when there was a picture of the Queen in every post office, children sang God Save the Queen whilst marching around the quadrangle at school. Smoking and sunbaking were actually good for you. Your neighbour was the same colour, religion and sexuality as you. Banks shut at 2:30, and we were yet to count our Indigenous people in the national census because we didn't believe they were actually people. We look back for things that were not there, things that never really existed. Traders do the same thing. We look at a series of what if only. But there is another context to the psychology of Brexit, which is interesting. And this decision to leave Europe caught people on the hop. What intrigued me was it caught the betting agencies on the hop. Betting agencies, by and large, are the best gauge of public sentiment. And on the day before the vote, I looked at the betting markets, and they had the chance of leaving the EU at only 25%. So they were caught on the hop. In part, we need to be careful when we look at experts. And for anyone wanting a refresher on this, I would suggest you look at the work of Philip Tetlock. Tetlock has found that so-called professional pundits, that is, professional commentators both on economics and politics, are generally no better at their predictions than the average crowd. But I think in part, many of the academics were caught on the hop because they actually underestimated how stupid people were. And the evidence of this is intriguing because following the vote, these were the largest questions being posed by people in the UK to Google. This is interesting because what it means is that people were making a decision about something they didn't understand. Again, to put this in the context of trading, around about the turn of the century, I was approached ad infinitum by various legal firms wanting me to do expert witness work against a variety of wealth creation promoters who'd gone around promoting what they would call to be a share renting scheme. For those of us who know better, it's known as a buy right. And the way they had structured these schemes had cost people vast sums of money and in some instances their home. So you had someone who did not understand a strategy selling it to people who knew even less about the strategy. But people were making decisions about something they did not understand. And this is a key point in trading. Too often I see people making decisions about things they simply do not understand. There is this notion that with trading, how hard could it be? Well, it's actually very hard. And it is extremely difficult. There are nuances, subtleties, there is background knowledge to understand. But all too often people drift into areas of trading simply on the basis of some half-assed idea that they've gotten, that they've heard, that they've read. And this is a component of human decision-making. This is the way we tend to approach things. Many people approach things with very much the attitude of, here, hold my beer and watch this. And you can see this is a spike in Google Trends. This is as the polls in Britain were closing. The question that was being posed to Google is, what happens if we leave the EU? So people were trying to work out what the consequences of their actions would be after the action had taken place. So they had gotten the decision-making back to front. In trading, we need to work out what the consequences of our actions will be before we undertake any form of action. What all this means is that our brains, this spongy little mass between our ears, is actually very, very poor at making important decisions. We struggle with decision making. And this, in some ways, is to be understood because our brain did not evolve to make the decisions it is now being forced to make. It evolved to cause us to wander around the tundra, look for something to eat, to avoid being eaten. And it is understandable that we would struggle with some decisions because in making a decision of any sort, we are bounded by a series of considerations. We can never have infinite time, we can never have perfect information, nor can we be infinitely intelligent. So therefore our decision making will always be bounded. We will always struggle with some aspect, or our decisions will always be imperfect. We can never make a perfect decision. However, in situations like Brexit, and the volatility we're experiencing in the market at present is simply an uncertainty premium. That's all volatility is. Volatility is a function of the market's response to people's emotional uncertainty. The issue in dealing with this is not whether you made money or lost money. The issue is whether you actually followed whatever plan you had, and whether that plan had in it a contingency to deal with exceptional volatility as it appears in the market. If you made money from Brexit, that's all well and good, that's good. But it's only good if you followed your plan. If you made money on a punt or a whim, then really your decision making is in line with someone who decides that entering Tats Lotto and potentially winning Tats Lotto will be the be-all and end-all of their financial planning.